Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast with Ron and Kristin, where leadership meets entertainment. This podcast features stories with names and certain aspects that have been changed to keep submissions private. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to the Dirty Side of Leadership podcast. Fear can take many forms and appear in all aspects of life. Now, folks, before you say, I'm not a fearful person, and turn the podcast off, hear this. Fear is what makes us human and the reason we are still in existence today. We all feel fear to some extent, and if we don't deal with it, our fears can keep us in unproductive patterns, even when we want to move forward in our career. Today, we are going to provide you with the tools necessary to defeat fear, or at minimum, control it. Make fear your bitch.
Kristin, I got to tell you, by the way, I didn't write that, everyone.
I had to.
So I have a long history with fear, and most of the time, fear starts in people's childhood. Mm-hmm. It's rare that you have someone that's never experienced fear. They don't have that emotional reaction, and then sometime later in life, they do. Now, if they're getting really old or there's a medical scare, of course, that's different. But I'm saying a lot of the things that we carry in life starts in childhood. I've got a few stories that happened in my childhood. I had a great-grandmother. She was a wonderful person, very articulate, but she would tell ghost/demon stories. A lot of them revolved around church.
Demon.
And I remember my uncle, as a matter of fact, she told me one time, my grandfather was a preacher. She said they were leaving this old country church and something jumped on top of the car. And he started praying and it jumped off. She didn't know if it was a wild animal or a demon or a ghost or whatever. But I'm 6 years old, Kristin, hearing this.
Oh, my gosh.
I had an uncle that was only 3 years older than me. And absolutely, back in the day, like, we slept together in a regular sized bed. And I kid you not, we made a plan of protection. I would lay on my side facing the wall so I could guard us from anything that might reach its hand up out of the bed. And he would lay on his back facing the room so he could see any threats coming to the room. And we would probably lay there for hours before we went to sleep. So that was one early childhood memory. And then one time I went to a wake at this church and I decided I was really bored. You know, I'm probably 10 years old. I'm bored. And I grew up in the country, so it was not uncommon to walk a mile, even at night. So I decided I'm going to walk home, and I had told a couple of family members, I am walking, and there's a graveyard. That's the only place, and it was really dark, no street light, and that's the only place I dreaded. But you had to walk past this graveyard and then around this big turn. It's about a mile. I'm walking, and all of a sudden, something comes out of the graveyard. And so another uncle had heard me say I'm leaving. He sprinted to get behind a tombstone and scared the living crap out of me. Now, that one did not torment me like the story about my great-grandmother, the stories plural, but it did cause me to have some fears. And I loved my mother, but she was a worrier, and she would worry when it snowed because you had to cross a mountain to get to a grocery store. That's right, you heard it, ladies and gentlemen. And she would just be very concerned about snow, or she was tormented by mice because her sister chased her around. So my point I'm telling you is sometimes we have to, as adults, think back to childhood, look at the origin of some of these things that really bother us, and we have to defeat that. And we did take an aggressive title on this episode, because you have to understand, if you are a person dealing with fear, it is a battle, but you can win that battle. You can absolutely win that battle. If you're someone who, I said this in another episode, I tell everyone in my trainings, everyone has a wall of fear. Now, it may be bigger, it may be smaller, but you have to chip away at that wall. You chip away or walk away, because greatness and your destiny is on the other side. So everyone has to overcome some type of fear in their lives. And we're going to give you the strategies and techniques that I believe will help you. I want to start off with something, Kristin, and I've gotten a lot of response on this because fear can hurt your self-esteem. Let me give you an example. Let's say that I'm afraid to speak in public, and you're not. then my brain tells me you're better than me,
right.
You're braver than me, because I've got this fear. And fears equal insecurity many times. But here's the point. Everyone has fear. Everyone has courage. What it is, it's compartmentalized. So let's say I may be brave enough to wrestle an alligator, but I don't want to speak in public. So am I a coward? It just means that I have compartmentalized this one fear. Something is holding me back from speaking in public. I have to recognize that compartment, open it up. I'm going to get rid of that fear, and I'm going to put something positive in there. And that is how, and we're going to get into mindfulness training, but that is the beginning of overcoming something that's holding you back. Now, you've already said, of course, there's some fears that you need. You need to be afraid to cross the road without looking both ways.
Right.
There are certain things, if you see someone walking toward you and they have a gun, it's late at night, and they are growling at you, you probably want to run. I'm being funny there. But there are some fears that keep us safe.
Yeah.
So once you realize fear is compartmentalized, you're going to open that compartment, and you're also going to remind yourself that I'm brave in many areas. I love the term mama bear. You mess with a mother's children, you will see courage on a level that you've never seen before. Trust me.
Yeah.
Now,
I'm like that with my husband, too. I'm a wifey bear.
Poor guy. There is a study that was done at Carnegie Mellon University, led by David Creswell. Now, I've given you a foundation about this compartmentalized fear, but this is actually scientifically proven, is that you can visualize a positive outcome. You can think good thoughts, which is a battle. I have to tell people, because I've coached someone and they start out, then they're like, Ron, my fear came back. And so I said, this has got to become habitual.
Yes.
These positive thoughts have got to become a habit. And as you visualize a positive outcome, it's a different outcome than what you had in your mind before. You're reprogramming your brain. And it's very possible. People do it all the time. And I'm going to encourage everyone, as we go through this podcast, please listen to all of this and put some of these things into practice. You're going to see a major change in your life. I could almost guarantee that. What do you think, Kristin?
Oh, absolutely. And what really stands out to me is visualization. And that's something that I've been doing for a long time. And I'll share my story of the origin. I was a gymnast for many years, and a competitive gymnast at that. And for about 5 years, my coach was a Bulgarian bronze medalist, and his name was Zdravko, just in case he's ever listening. I haven't talked to him forever. But Zdravko, he would teach us mindfulness and visualization. And this is at a very young age, but this is how he was taught in Bulgaria. And so what that looked like was, in gymnastics, we have 4 different routines that we have to memorize and 4 different apparatus that you compete on. And so part of our daily gymnastics practice was visualization. You're visualizing yourself going through your routines. And that was, that's pretty nuanced, I would say. I don't think that a lot of sports take time and put time aside for visualization. But it was really cool. And it meant so much, because as you physically start going through your routine, you've already done it a million times in your head. And so it's just second nature, and you do it so much better because you know it's almost like muscle memory, even though it's your mind that's been visualizing. Something that happened that really needed this visualization and the mindfulness was, I was competing in a state competition, and on the bars, which was actually my very least favorite apparatus, on the bars, I had an entire rip. Gymnasts just call it I ripped, but your entire you can get small rips. For those that work out, you get those calluses on your hand. When you're working on bars, on a bar routine, those get really bad and they rip off. And so my rip was my entire palm, and this is a state competition. And I had made it to the next phase, the final phase, and I had this massive rip on my palm, incredibly painful. Zdravko had me visualize that my hands were no longer part of my body. And that sounds completely crazy. And at the time, I believe I was 12, 13. But I listened to him and I did it. And I was able to go and compete my very last bar routine with this massive rip on my hand. And it didn't hurt until I landed and walked out of the judge's presence. And then you really feel the pain. But it just shows you the power of the mind. And I'm sure so many people listening are familiar with Carrie Strug. She won the gold. She had a broken ankle and she had one more vault to do. And she vaulted with a broken ankle. And I can almost guarantee you she had to visualize that that ankle was not part of her body as well. The mind is powerful, and you can train and trick your mind into doing amazing things.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. And I have some martial arts stories, but I do want to tell those when we talk about discipline in another episode. But that is very powerful, and I don't even think and scientists agree, we haven't even reached, a fraction of the potential of the human brain. But we also have to understand, and this is more of that guilt complex, the brain is designed to protect you. So your first response outside of visualization like you're doing, your first response, your brain's going to be saying, get that hand taken care of.
Right. You
need first aid. You need to go to the doctor. Your brain is designed that way, and we have to understand that. So we got to train the brain, right? So I want to talk about the physiological factors of fear. Now, we've all heard of fight or flight, and without getting too technical, in the 30s, scientists began to study zebras, and when a lion or a predator would get close, the hair would stand up. They would either run or freeze. So really, we've always heard fight or flight, but it should be fight, freeze, or flight. Mm-hmm. In human beings, we deal with that. I know you've heard of people who freeze up.
Yeah.
And what happens is, again, without getting too in depth, the visual cortex, let's say there is an external threat. It sees the threat, it goes to the amygdala, the frontal cortex, and it just keeps circulating in the brain. And that's why mindfulness training will change the behavior or the psychological aspects of the brain. It's very important, and I want to reemphasize that it's hard work. I guarantee if your coach had never introduced you to that, and he just walked up to you at that track meet and said, just pretend your hand isn't there, I doubt that you would have been able to do that. It does take some time if you're going to apply these principles. Yeah. Now, one of the things that we have to do is visualize a positive outcome. And I said that earlier. You have to change the script in your mind. There has to be an alternate ending. So when a bad thought comes in, you replace that. You go into that compartment, as I said, you open it up, and you replace that. As part of your training, breathing techniques are vital. Now, I do a couple of different things. 4-7-8 breathing is when you breathe in 4 seconds, you hold it 7 seconds, and you completely exhale 8 seconds. I actually have people do this in my trainings. But then there's something called a grounding breath. And Kristin, that's where you just take a deep breath, but people can't even see you. I remember going into very difficult meetings or going on a phone call, and I would do the one grounding breath. It disrupts blood flow. See, what happens when you get nervous, the blood starts rushing, and you start to feel dizzy. These are all those physiological factors I talked about. You get tunnel vision. There's people been in car accidents, and it happens in slow motion. Yeah. Or they lose their auditory sensory component. They don't hear things. And that's why people many times don't understand. Like, I remember as a police officer, I asked someone what happened, and they can't tell you, and they're really not lying.
Right.
And sometimes it takes a full sleep cycle for people to get their memory back. So this whole dynamic is so interesting, the human brain. But if you never delve into this, you never improve.
Right.
So one of the things that I do in training, the full day training, which Kristin will be doing as well, is we end it with scenarios. So the reason the military, police, firefighters, medical people, like there's so many people that know this, they do scenarios. They practice in a dynamic environment. So Kristin, let's say that an employee's been coming in late, and you have to address that. Now, I'm not going to do it on this podcast, but I built a framework of preferred words to use that people seem to respond to in a better way. But what you would do is script out your talking points, and it only takes a few minutes. It's what you're going to say because it keeps you on track. And if you do get emotional, you can veer off track and cause yourself a lot of problems.
Right.
So you kind of stick with the script and you actually practice it. In the meantime, you're practicing your breathing and you're visualizing that this is going to go well. I'm going to coach this, employee, or it might be a child. I'm going to coach them and it's going to be a positive outcome. They're going to do better at the end of this. And when I do this training, I've got scenarios and I pair people up. One person is the manager, one's an employee, and they address the coming in late. That's just one of many scenarios. They've already scripted it out. They take a grounding breath when they start. And I ask them at the end of it, what did you do well? And I have the other person say what they think, the manager did well, we'll say. And then we talk about it. But I also ask them what their anxiety level is. And I've had people, believe it or not, fall apart in these scenarios. So I have them repeat it because you never want a training scar. You don't want people leaving defeated from a training.
Right.
You want them to leave successfully. Now, back in the day, we didn't know that in police training. I learned that later when I was with the feds about training scars. So you want to set people up to win. But I can assure our listeners, viewers, if you visualize that positive outcome and if you'll practice regular grounding breaths, you're telling your brain it's time to relax, it's time to chill, and your brain will respond to that. You disrupt the blood flow, you pause, and then you practice in that dynamic environment. I have people, when I coach them on interview skills, I have them practice in the car, going through some talking points that they want to get across. And it's helped immensely. So it is possible. Thoughts, Kristin?
Yeah, no, it's amazing. And as you're talking about this, it is easy, especially if you have a relationship with your employee. It's easy to get off track and to lose your breath and to lose your mindfulness because your emotional aspect, you're human, right? So the emotions will play into it. But if you practice, and Ron, I looked at your one pager on tools that you use, great tools to add into the tool belt for anybody. And we really should dive into that maybe towards the end. But it's incredible the difference that it will make if you go in practiced.
Kristin, this is a little off base, but I do want to throw this in because I saw it time and time again when I was coaching leaders, actually when some were working for me and with me. We have a tendency, once we have provided corrective feedback, to grovel. And basically, let's say, Kristin, you and I work together and you've had to talk to me about coming in late. Your human nature is going to be, come on, Ron, we work together. I don't want to have this meeting.
Right.
That's called groveling. You never want to do that. I tell managers, end the meeting in a professional manner, explain the expectations, make sure they understood what you conveyed.
Right.
And maybe if it's serious enough, follow up with an email and tell them you're going to reschedule a meeting to talk about it in 2 weeks to gauge progress. Now, this is free. This is based on my own experimentation, and I've trained hundreds of leaders on this. You should always circle around within 48 hours if possible and just stop by someone's office, give them a quick call, and just say, hey, now don't discuss the issue. This is not the 2-week meeting. This is to let them know, hey, just want to see how you're doing. You good?
I like
How was
that.
your weekend? What happens is once you have provided corrective feedback, some people have not been trained in what we're talking about, Kristin, and guess what happens? They start thinking, I'm going to get fired. My boss hates me.
Right.
They're out to get me, and it grows into a whole world.
Yes.
But by you doing that follow-up within 48 hours, and you can't be robotic, you can't make it look like, you call and say, hey, how you doing? They say, fine, good, thanks, bye.
Right.
So it's awkward with maybe a hybrid work environment, but if you can swing by someone's office with a smile, hey, just wanted to see how you're doing, and don't get sucked into that. If they start wanting to talk about that, say, hey, let's talk about that at our 2-week meeting that we scheduled.
Yeah,
but
that's powerful.
I have had so many managers tell me, Ron, that helps so much.
Yes. And even in a hybrid work environment, my last 3 years at the bank were remote, 100% remote. And you can make just as much impact over the phone or you can do it like a Teams meeting or whatever your company uses. But even just a phone call them on their personal phone. I mean, anything like that means a lot. It goes far.
Yeah,
and it's disarming.
Does.
It disarms them. Because when you do receive some coaching or some feedback, formal or informal, those who care a lot, they're going, like you said, they're going to become slightly insecure and not really understand where they stand with their leader. And so when you do that 24-hour follow-up like that, you are disarming them and making them feel more comfortable.
Exactly. What else you got for us, Kristin?
I like that. Well, I wanted to share, going back to fear and stress, I wanted to share a personal story. And this one, I'm going to be pretty vulnerable on this because, again, this is all about the power of the mind. And I know I've mentioned numerous times I'm about brain health. And this may give you a little bit of an indication into why I started getting so into it. But so I want to go back to when I was 6 months pregnant with my son. This is 2014. And I woke up in the middle of the night and had... Basically, I didn't know at the time, but I had tachycardia. My heart rate was beating out of control. I'm home alone. My husband worked nights in law enforcement, home alone with my young daughter. And I'm like, this is interesting. So I'm like breathing, and I went outside to get some cold, fresh air and did all the things that I thought you should do to bring your heart rate down. So after about an hour of trying to bring it down on my own, I called the doctor. This is, again, like 3 a.m. I called, and they were concerned because I was pregnant, so they thought I was having some type of embolism or something. They wanted me to come down there. So then my heart rate really got going fast. But long story short, I end up in the ER. My heart was beating about 150 BPM for about 8 hours. And then the doctor finally came in and said, all your tests are totally normal. We don't know what caused this. My heart rate went all the way down into the 90s, like almost instantaneously. And what was wild for me is, one, I didn't know what caused it. I woke up that way. I wasn't stressed out that I knew of. I wasn't worrying. I was literally sleeping and woke up like that. But what it showed me was the power of the mind, because as soon as that doctor came in and said that to me, I watched it. I was hooked up to the monitors. I watched it drop. It was that reassurance, apparently, that I needed. So I was okay for a while. A few years go by, and I'm attending my cousin's wedding in Arizona. Had a few adult beverages, was dancing on the dance floor. And, of course, Arizona was hot. I noticed that when we were done and we were all wrapping up and going back to the hotel, that my heart rate, my rate of return was slow. So my heart rate was still faster than it should have been after discontinuing dancing. So I took note of that, and immediately my mind went to 2014. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm having tachycardia again. So what ended up happening was I was in my head a lot. We're in the hotel. I'm doing some deep breathing. I have one of my good friends since kindergarten with me. Thankfully, she's a very understanding gal. My mind is just going places I didn't want it to go. Like, great, I'm going to end up in the ER again. I was able to bring my heart rate down and went to bed and woke up 3 a.m. My heart rate is 150, 160 beats per minute. So I end up having to go to the ER in Arizona again because I wasn't 100% sure that it was just a panic attack at that point in time. So I ended up getting, basically I was brought to the ER, and then they actually, I can't think of the terminology right now, but I actually had to stay 24 hours in the hospital. They admitted me, that's it, and ran every test under the sun to try to figure out what was going on. It literally, after all of that, it was a panic attack. And I had low iron, which played into why my rate of return was slow. The power of the mind is so next level. It's hard for most of us to even understand it. But once again, my mind had taken control of the situation. I'm dancing on the dance floor. It's hot out. I've had alcohol. I had low iron levels. All of that made my rate of return slow. My heart rate would have gone down. Life would have been just fine. I would have flown out the next morning as planned. But my mind triggered back to 2014 when I had that panic attack, and there I went again. And that stayed with me for a while. It took me, I had to do some therapy for about 6 months just because I lived in fear. Am I going to have a panic attack again? I was nervous to go out of town. I didn't want to have to go to the hospital again, especially when you're out of town. That is a very uncomfortable feeling. I lived in this constant state of anxiety and fear, even though I had all these tests telling me that I was fine. So the mind is incredibly powerful. And I worked with my psychologist at the time, and we were able to, he did a lot of the breathing, the round breathing, just a lot of mindfulness work, breath work to really understand what was triggering that and how to completely retrain the brain. And here I am today. That was 2018. So 5 years and I'm doing great, but it took work. You have to put the work in, but you can retrain your brain.
It does take work. And Kristin, thank you for being vulnerable. That's a interesting story. Remember, I said the brain is designed to protect us. So your brain went back to 2014.
Yes.
Your brain is going to do that. It's going to recall memories.
Yes.
When I do active shooter training, I say the brain doesn't want to believe there's a shooter. It wants to remember the car that backfired, something that it can recall.
Yes. And the time, 3 a.m. Both times. My psychologist said that is your brain. It was going right back. Not only was it the same, the same heart rate, but it was the same time in the morning.
Okay, so that's pretty heavy, but let's get to another part of that story that I'm sure our listeners are interested in. You told me before we started you're wearing that Hammer Time jacket.
Yeah. We look like Miami Vice, the two of us.
Were you doing the hammer dance when you were out there dancing?
Yeah,
you can't touch this.
I walked by my husband. I'm like, all right, I'm going to go record. And he was like, oh, what are you wearing there? So for those that are just listening, the oversized MC Hammer blazer look is really in, and mine's pink. Ron's wearing a nice mint. Makes me want mint chocolate chip ice cream. And I told Ron, I'm like, I look like MC Hammer. I might go change. He's like, no, leave it be.
You can't touch this, Kristin.
Exactly. You can't touch this. No, you can't.
Since our listeners, viewers have stuck with us, I'm going to go just slightly deeper. We're going to talk about stress, and I want to explain something. Fear and stress are cousins. If there's an external threat and you become fearful, that turns into stress. They pass the baton, right? So stress can be handled in much the same way, but I want to take one more level, and that is, I know we say mindfulness, but how do we do that? Right. I've already said you got to have an alternate outcome, a positive outcome. But here's what happens as you dissect stress. I guarantee you will speak stressful words. You will exhibit stressful actions or fearful actions. So as part of reprogramming the brain, speak. We have an inner ear. It is so powerful to encourage ourselves because we hear it in a different way. That's why when people hear themselves on a recording, they go, I don't sound like that, because you hear
people
yourself.
People hate that. Yes.
It's true.
Yes.
It's true. I sound like Elvis, to myself, even when I sing.
Oh my gosh.
But we have an inner ear, and we need to speak positive words. So we're thinking positive thoughts. We're speaking positive words. Don't allow yourself to say, I'm scared to death all the time, or I'm worried this is going to happen. I regret this. Stop it. Speak positive words over you. So you've got positive thoughts, positive words, and guess what follows? Those two, your actions will follow. And as let's say we've talked a little bit about public speaking. That was one of my long-term fears, is I visualize a positive outcome. I speak words of affirmation over myself. Sometimes you don't have anyone to do it. You speak it over yourself. And then my action was I got up and gave the speech, or I got up and spoke. And the crazy thing is, for me now, because I ended up in a career where I had to speak all the time, it's hard for me to believe that I was afraid because it's so natural now. And you can get there too if you're listening, if there is something that's holding you back. But I want to touch on two other things here. So we've talked about thoughts, words, actions, and that is talking to a trusted friend. You would be surprised how powerful it is to hear someone else say, you're awesome, you can do this. That's why I love the story about your coach, Kristin, and when I do coaching, I basically do 2 phone calls a week. But if someone needs me, and I had someone was in a crisis and they called me because they had to actually it was a situation I won't go into, but they actually had to speak to the press.
Oh, wow.
So they were wanting me to help them write a press release, which I was fine to do. Mm-hmm. But I said, hold on. Yeah. Let's breathe. This is going to go great. As a matter of fact, this is only going to be newsworthy for about 2 days, and then people are going to move on. So that part helped more than me helping to write a press release. It was that just take a breath. You're going to be fine. This is going to pass. This too shall pass. I've said that so many times.
Yes.
And the other one, and I can never minimize this enough, and I know people vary, and I get it, Kristin, but it's our faith.
Right.
I've said Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. I've said that so many times in my life, and there's something when you know that there's a God that loves you and is on your team, it's hard to fail if you can understand that. So many times, I remember one time I went into this funk, and I probably read half of the book of Psalms, which is huge, 100 and some chapters I read so far, and then it just lifted. I just was free as a bird.
I love that.
So I want to make sure that our listeners get that extra additive and never minimize someone's faith. Why do you think they call the priest, the minister, in a crisis? They know how calming that presence can be. Or you call that friend who's got your back, who will take care of you and help you. And of course, we need to try to be that friend as well.
Right.
So, Kristin, I definitely wanted to share that as we're winding down here. What else you got?
Yeah. Well, I wanted to share about words of affirmation. I know you were touching on it just then. Some people don't understand. Words of affirmation, it's not what you're saying in your mind. It needs to be audible, and there is science behind that. So when you're saying words of affirmation, it can literally be when you're commuting. It could be when you're home getting ready in the morning. It can be in the shower, but you need to be able to hear it. So Ron touched on that, but that is really important. No, you can't just be in your head cycling through, right? It's not like, how you can say a prayer in your mind. It's not like that. Words of affirmation, you need to hear it. So on that, let me give you a little science behind it. So the subconscious mind learns through repetition, and you can change your brain, your cells, and your genes. And this is done through neuroplasticity, which is basically the ability of networks in the brain to change through growth and organization. And actually, just to put it into perspective, a simple smile, spurs a chemical reaction in the brain, and it releases certain hormones, including dopamine and serotonin. And dopamine increases our feelings of happiness. Serotonin release is associated with reduced stress. So you can trick and train your brain with merely a smile.
We got to make T-shirts, Kristin. Train your brain. I like it.
Yes, I do too.
TYB.
Yeah, I love it. Hashtag.
Just kind of a final thing I wanted to say about stress. And it's basically, and yes, I'm promoting our training, but I teach people what's called parrying. And in the fighter's world, that means you're redirecting something. You don't want it, if something's in the path of your face, you want to redirect it. You want to move out of the way. So in addition to our positive self-talk, our grounding breath, visualizing, the positive outcome, all of these things work together. Again, I've said talk to someone, all of that. But when you're in the moment, you don't have time to talk to someone. You may not have time to quote scripture. You're in that moment. So you have to think about the problem with stress sometimes. Fear we usually recognize. But stress, you could be stressed a whole day and you don't even stop to think, wait a minute, I'm stressed out.
Right.
Or maybe you just say I'm stressed out, but you don't look at the origin or you don't think about it.
Right.
So another technique that I have used is I remind myself, in addition to all the things we've talked about, remind yourself of past victories. Like right now, Kristin, you can look back and say, I made it through 2014.
Right.
My heart rate was up, but I made it through. I'm good. And as you remind yourself of past victories, it helps you relax. It helps you calm down.
Right.
And here's something that, man, it is so important as well. And this was one of my questions I would ask people when they're really stressed out. This is in my crisis and stress coaching. What have you done for someone lately? Have you been helping? Is there any benevolence in your life? And basically, there's this intrinsic award, just like smiling you talked about. There's this intrinsic reward or award for people who do good for other people.
Yes.
If you go and you, let's say, I'm involved with a business in South Carolina, going places, and what they do is they give bikes to needy children. And now it's grown to the point, they were building like 400 bikes. So if I donate, or people that help put bikes together, they don't want me doing that part. Yeah, they're like, are you sure this is a bicycle? Anyway, when you help or when you get involved in community activities, it will boost your whole attitude. You will feel emotionally stronger. You'll know that there's a purpose. You feel like you're fulfilling a purpose. And everyone, that's the big question everyone asks, what's my purpose? Well, maybe it's just to help people. Maybe it's just a smile. Maybe it's something small, but it will also elevate you. And if people will take this episode seriously, I promise you there's going to be a drastic change in your life.
Right.
Yeah, instead of being defeated all the time, you're going to thrive. You're going to be victorious. And man, when I started learning positive self-talk and all these things, I do not think, Kristin, I would have gotten promoted. But I read this little book called The Dynamics of Faith and Confession by Charles Capps, and it was all about speaking positive words, the inner ear that I just said. And I just became a positive guy. And the next thing you know, I used to tell employees this, and I've said it on the podcast before, positivity is like a magnet. If you're positive, it draws people, but if you're negative, it repels people. You ever had that person you're like, oh God, there he comes. You pretend you're on the phone.
Well, I've had people not like me that's pretty rare, I have to be honest. Now, that sounds really bad. But the few employees that didn't like me, for a minute, I had to reflect, and after some reflection, I'm like, they're very negative people. And of course, they don't want to be around somebody like me.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I completely concur on that. And I just I'm going to give someone some affirmations, because again, this is what I used to do for myself when I was going through the panic attacks, and mine were more health related, but I do it in other ways as well. But for me at that point, it was, you are healthy. You are strong. You are okay. Right. And I would repeat that back to myself when I was going to work or in the morning. And Ron, I'm going to put you on the spot. What are some affirmations that you could do for yourself?
Well, I look in the mirror. I'm sorry. No, I do this all the time. I said this previously. My daughter Haley reminded me, when we're running, when I get to a certain point, I'm feeling tired. I'm like, we got this. We got this.
Yeah,
nothing can stop us. So yeah, I do positive affirmations, but also remind myself of past victories. If I was in the middle of a difficult court case, I go, you know what? You got through that other one. You're going to get through this one.
Right.
It's that type. But I was hoping you would give me one and just tell me I'm awesome. Kristin.
Ron, you are a motivator.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
You are so welcome.
Kristin, you're awesome.
Well, thanks. Appreciate that.
I was going to go into a little bit about a meeting, but Kristin, I think we should wind down.
Save it.
I think we should save it. But man, we got a lot of activity on the Facebook group, and I just want to remind people how grateful we are. I visited my daughter at her office, and my youngest daughter, and this female came out. She stuck her head around the corner and goes, "Hi, I listen to your podcast."
Oh, I love that.
Yes, it's such a cool feeling. It's just been an awesome journey, and we had people in the Facebook group give us ideas for future podcasts, and believe me, we're going to discuss those.
Oh my gosh, so many great ones.
So many great ones. I almost thought we should have a Q&A and just go through each one of those.
Goodness,
there were so many good ideas. So we are so grateful.
Yes,
we are. And the podcast is growing, and it's just going to get more and more exciting. Chris and I are finding our groove. I tried to avoid some of the word whiskers that I mentioned that we went into last week. I literally, Kristin, you may not remember me saying this, but we talked about well.
Oh, yeah.
And I've got this friend, Jeff, and he's in Nebraska. I told you when I was a kid, we would say whelp. Whelp.
I
just got one word on the text that said whelp.
That's amazing. Well, we also talked about we have to give ourselves grace, though, because that last episode, I was so in my head because I started tallying myself. And then I'm like, oh my gosh, I can't even focus. So we are giving ourselves grace on those word whiskers while being mindful of how often we use them.
We did the same thing. Yeah. We did the episode on narcissistic bosses, and almost everything I would say, if it was Kurt, I'd be going, wait, would a narcissist say that? And of course, when Kristin says something, I would say, as a narcissist would say.
Yeah. Oh, goodness. Good times, Ron.
Good times. Any final thoughts?
Well, we have a good one already planned. It was one topic from a submitter. So we're excited to dive into something a little new next week and hope that you tune in. You better, because we know where you are.
That's right.
We'll find you. We have your IP address.
No fear.
Yeah, no fear. Don't be stressed. Don't be fearful. But no, we really appreciate everyone, and we are really excited to continue this journey and want you to go find us so you can interact with us. Not only listen, rate, subscribe, all of that is critical, but interact with us on social, and we can get some great ideas from you.
Absolutely. All right. Be the leader you're meant to be.
We'll see you next week.
The Dirty Side of Leadership podcast is brought to you by Forward Operations. If you'd like to book Ron or Kristin for speaking events, training, or executive coaching, visit forwardoperations.com. Be the leader you're meant to be.